Have you ever heard a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath? Before we begin, I need to know something. Where are you listening to this from right now? Drop it in the comments below because I love knowing where our listeners are tuning in from. Whether you're alone in your room at midnight or driving through empty highways, this story takes place in the Appalachian Highlands in a year when the mountains still held their secrets close and the valleys below held more questions than answers. It was the autumn of 1897, and the world was changing in ways that left some places behind, forgotten in the shadows of progress. The location I'm about to describe no longer appears on any map. Though if you search hard enough through county records that survived the fire of 1923, you might find references to a settlement called Ravenmore Crossing, nestled deep in a hollow where three ridges converged like the fingers of some massive hand cupping the valley floor. The crossing itself was named for a stone bridge that spanned Widow's Creek, a waterway that ran cold and clear even in the driest summers, fed by springs that bubbled up from somewhere deep beneath the limestone foundations of the mountains themselves. Into this place, in the early days of September, came a man named Virgil Ashmont, 34 years old, a surveyor by trade, who had been hired by the Cumberland and Virginia Railway Company to assess potential routes through the highlands for their proposed expansion line. Virgil was tall, nearly 6 feet and 3 inches, with a lean build that came from years of walking rough country, and he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of someone who'd spent more time under open sky than under roof. His hands were large and capable, scarred in the way that comes from handling chains and transit equipment across rocky terrain, and his eyes were a peculiar shade of gray that seemed to change with the light, sometimes appearing almost colorless like winter ice. He'd been working the Virginia highlands for nearly a decade, mapping routes that would never be built, assessing timber stands for companies that would fold before cutting a single tree. And he developed a reputation among the railway men as someone who could navigate country that broke other surveyors, who could read terrain like some men read newspapers. Virgil arrived in Ravenmore Crossing on a Thursday afternoon when the light was already beginning to fail, the sun dropping behind the western ridge early, as it does in the deep hollows where the mountains steal hours from each end of the day. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 structures scattered along both sides of the creek, most of them log construction with stone chimneys and a single dirt road that served as the main thoroughfare, though calling it that would be generous given that it was barely wide enough for a wagon and turned to soup with every rain. There was a general store that also served as the post office, a blacksmith's forge that Virgil could hear ringing as he approached, and what might have been a church or meeting house, though the building looked like it hadn't seen congregants in some time, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar in a way that suggested either abandonment or indifference. The population, as near as Virgil could tell from the census records he'd reviewed before departing, was listed at 63 souls, though he suspected that number was generous or outdated, possibly both, because the settlement had that particular emptiness that comes to places people are slowly leaving one family at a time until only the stubborn or the trapped remain. He'd arranged lodging through correspondence with a man named Hosea Grimstead who operated what passed for a boarding house at the northern end of the settlement, a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the east as if the ground beneath it was slowly giving way. Hosea himself was waiting on the porch when Virgil arrived, a man of perhaps 50 years with a build that had once been powerful but was now running to fat, his face dominated by a bristling mustache that had more gray than brown, and eyes that assessed Virgil with the particular weariness that mountain people reserve for outsiders, which in these parts meant anyone who hadn't been born within sight of the ridges. The surveyor extended his hand and introduced himself, explaining his purpose in coming to Ravenmore Crossing, and Hosea accepted the handshake with a grip that was still strong despite the softness that had crept into his frame, though his expression didn't warm much beyond basic civility. "You'll be wanting the corner room upstairs," Hosea said, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who'd never had reason to hurry a conversation. "It's got the best light for working, which I figure a man in your profession might appreciate, and it's away from the road, such as it is, so you won't be bothered by what little traffic we get through here." Virgil thanked him and hauled his equipment inside, 2 large cases containing his transit and chains, a smaller case with his plotting tools and field books, and a worn canvas pack that held his personal effects, which weren't much given his itinerant profession. The room Hosea had assigned him was sparse but clean, with a single bed that had a corn-husk mattress, a small desk positioned beneath the window where the afternoon light would indeed be good for drafting, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. The walls were bare timber, the gaps between the logs chinked with what looked like a mixture of mud and moss, and the floor was plank wood that showed the wear of decades, the boards smooth in the paths where feet had passed most often. Virgil set his equipment in the corner and moved to the window, looking out over the settlement and the valley beyond, watching as the last of the daylight painted the western ridge in shades of amber and rust, the hollows already filling with shadow like dark water rising from below. There was something about the quality of that light, the way it seemed to die rather than fade, that gave him a moment of unease, though he couldn't have explained why. If pressed, he'd seen hundreds of mountain sunsets, worked in valleys more remote than this, walked ridges where you could go days without seeing another human being, and yet something about Ravenmore Crossing felt different in a way that his surveyor's instinct couldn't quite measure. It was the kind of feeling that makes the back of your neck prickle, that sense that you're being watched even when you can see that you're alone. And Virgil found himself pulling the window curtain closed earlier than he normally would have, shutting out the gathering dusk before it could settle completely. He spent the evening reviewing his maps and the railway company's proposed route corridors, making notes about the terrain he'd need to assess starting the following morning. And when he finally extinguished his lamp and settled into bed, he lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds of the settlement quieting for the night, the distant barking of a dog, the creak of the boarding house settling, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been the creek running over its rocky bed, or might have been something else entirely, a low murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. Morning came late to the hollow, the sun having to clear the eastern ridge before it could touch the valley floor, and Virgil woke to find the settlement wrapped in a fog so dense he could barely see the buildings across the road. He dressed and made his way downstairs, where Hosea had set out a breakfast of fried cornmeal mush, salt pork, and coffee so strong it was nearly black, and the two men ate in a silence that wasn't entirely comfortable, broken only by Hosea's occasional questions about Virgil's plans for the day. The surveyor explained that he intended to begin by walking the proposed route corridor along the eastern ridge, establishing benchmark points that he could use to begin his triangulation work, and Hosea listened with an expression that suggested he was only half paying attention, or perhaps that his mind was elsewhere entirely. When Virgil mentioned that he planned to work his way north along the ridge toward an area his maps indicated as Thornback Hollow, Hosea's expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes that spoke of concern or perhaps warning. "That's rough country up there," the boarding housekeeper said slowly, setting down his coffee cup with more care than seemed necessary. "Rough in ways that don't show up on maps, if you take my meaning. Lots of ravines and drop-offs, and the ridge gets narrow in places, barely room to keep your footing. Might be you'd want to hire a localman to guide you through, someone who knows where the safe paths are." Virgil appreciated the concern but explained that he'd worked alone for years and preferred it that way, that he moved faster without having to adjust to someone else's pace. And besides, the railway company's budget didn't include funds for local guides, which was typical of their penny-pinching approach to preliminary surveys. Hosea accepted this with a shrug that suggested he'd said his piece and bore no responsibility for what came next, though Virgil noticed that the older man watched him gather his equipment with an expression that might have been worry or might have been something else, something that looked almost like pity. The fog was still heavy when Virgil set out, his transit and chains slung over his shoulder, his field book and compass secured in his jacket pockets, and his boots already wet from the moisture that hung in the air like suspended rain. The settlement was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and he saw no one as he made his way along the road toward the eastern ridge, following a path that Hosea had indicated would take him to the base of the climb. The trail, such as it was, wound upward through dense stands of oak and hickory, the trees looming out of the fog like sentinels, their leaves already beginning to turn with the approaching autumn, splashes of yellow and red that appeared suddenly in the gray murk and then vanished just as quickly as he moved past. The climb was steep, his breath coming harder as he gained elevation, and he had to stop several times to rest and let his heart rate settle, using those moments to take compass bearings and make preliminary notes about the terrain. The fog seemed to move with him, never quite lifting but shifting in ways that created brief pockets of visibility before closing in again. And more than once Virgil had the strange sensation that the landscape around him was rearranging itself when he wasn't looking directly at it, that the trees were slightly different each time the fog parted, though he knew that was just a trick of the limited visibility and the disorienting effect of climbing through such murk. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the ridge line, and when he finally emerged onto the relatively flat crest, the fog was beginning to thin, burning off in irregular patches that allowed glimpses of the valley below and the mountains beyond, layer upon layer of ridges receding into blue distance like waves frozen in stone. He spent the rest of the morning establishing his first benchmark point, setting up his transit and carefully measuring the angles to various peaks and landmarks that he could identify through the breaks in the fog, recording everything in his field book with the meticulous precision that had made him valuable to the railway companies. Despite his preference for working alone, the work was absorbing in the way that technical tasks can be, requiring enough concentration that the world narrowed to the view through his transit scope and the numbers in his calculations. It wasn't until the sun was directly overhead, or as overhead as it gets in these mountains, that he realized he'd been hearing a sound for some time without consciously registering it. It was a rhythmic tapping, metal on stone, coming from somewhere to the north along the ridge. And for a moment, Virgil thought it might be another surveyor, or perhaps someone working a small mine claim, though he'd seen no indication of mining activity in the area during his preliminary research. He packed up his transit and moved toward the sound, curious and also vaguely annoyed that someone else might be working in what he'd assumed was his exclusive survey zone, though of course he had no claim to the land beyond his temporary right to cross it for the railway company's purposes. The tapping grew louder as he approached, more distinct, and he could tell now that it was definitely someone working with metal tools, the ring of a hammer on a drill or chisel, though the rhythm was odd, irregular in a way that suggested either inexperience or some pattern that Virgil couldn't quite grasp. He rounded a shoulder of rock and stopped because the source of the sound was immediately visible, but made no sense whatsoever. There was a man working on the exposed rock face of the ridge, perhaps 50 yards ahead, but he appeared to be carving or drilling into the stone itself for no apparent purpose. And as Virgil watched, the men would strike several blows in one spot, then move to another location several feet away and repeat the process, then move again, following some pattern that was invisible to the surveyor's eye. And that's a good moment to pause and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone doing something that made absolutely no sense, but they were so focused on it that you knew it meant something to them, something important? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I find that sometimes the strangest behaviors have the most profound reasons behind them. Now, speaking of this story, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, this is being narrated by the fear behind you. If you like this kind of historical horror content, hit that subscribe button. And if you're hearing this on some other channel, know that they've stolen our content without permission, so please report them for us. We work hard to bring you these unique stories and it means everything when you support the original creators. All right, back to Virgil on that ridge in 1897 watching a man engaged in behavior that defied explanation. The surveyor called out a greeting, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, but the man didn't respond, didn't even pause in his work, the hammer continuing to rise and fall with that same irregular rhythm. Virgil called out again, louder this time, and when there was still no response, he began to move closer, picking his way carefully across the rocky surface of the ridge. And as he approached, he could see the man more clearly. He was older, perhaps 60 or more, with hair that had gone completely white and hung past his shoulders, matted and tangled, and he wore clothes that had once been good quality, a wool suit that might have been expensive when it was new, but was now so worn and stained that the original color was impossible to determine. His hands, gripping the hammer and chisel, were gnarled and scarred, the knuckles swollen in the way that comes from years of hard use and probably arthritis. And his face, when Virgil finally got close enough to see it clearly, was so deeply lined that it looked like weathered bark, the skin stretched tight over prominent bones, the eyes deeply sunken but burning with an intensity that was immediately unsettling. Virgil was now close enough to see what the man was carving into the rock, and what he saw made him stop completely, his surveyor's mind trying to make sense of patterns that seemed to have no logic or purpose. The stone was covered with marks, hundreds or perhaps thousands of them, carved at varying depths, some fresh and bright where the hammer had recently struck, others weathered and dark as if they'd been there for years. They weren't letters or numbers, at least not in any alphabet or notation system that Virgil recognized, and they didn't seem to be pictures or representations of anything from the natural world. They were more like symbols, abstract and geometric, circles and lines and angles that intersected and overlaid each other in ways that made Virgil's eyes hurt when he tried to follow the patterns, as if there was some underlying structure that his mind couldn't quite grasp but kept trying to find. The old man continued his work, seemingly oblivious to Virgil's presence despite being close enough now that the surveyor could have reached out and touched him, and up close the rhythm of the hammer blows seemed even stranger, sometimes rapid and light, other times heavy and measured, following no pattern that Virgil could detect but clearly following some pattern because the old man never hesitated, never paused to consider where to strike next. Virgil tried one more time to get the man's attention, this time actually reaching out to touch his shoulder. And the moment his fingers made contact, the old man spun around with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his apparent age, the hammer rising in a motion that was clearly defensive or perhaps aggressive, and Virgil stumbled backward, his boot heel catching on an uneven patch of stone, nearly losing his balance entirely. The old man's eyes fixed on Virgil's face with an expression that was wild and terrified and furious all at once, and when he spoke, his voice was like gravel sliding down a metal chute, rough and painful sounding. "You shouldn't be here," the old man said, each word coming out separately, as if he had to remember how to form them. "You shouldn't see this. Nobody should see this. Not yet. Not until it's finished. And it's not finished. It won't be finished for 7 more years if I calculated correctly, which I believe I did, though the mathematics are complex beyond anything you could understand, beyond anything most minds could contain without breaking." Virgil raised his hands in a gesture meant to be calming and tried to explain that he was just a surveyor, that he meant no harm and had no interest in whatever work the old man was doing. But the explanation seemed to agitate rather than calm, and the old man's grip on his hammer tightened visibly. "A surveyor," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "A measurer. That's worse. That's so much worse than I thought. Because you'll measure it, won't you? You'll record it. You'll put it in your books and on your maps, and then others will come. They always come when you start measuring things, start putting them into numbers and lines as if the world can be contained that way, as if reality can be pinned down with angles and coordinates." The old man was moving as he spoke, not toward Virgil, but around him, circling in a way that made the surveyor turn to keep him in view, and Virgil was becoming increasingly aware that he was alone on this ridge with someone who was clearly not in their right mind, someone who was holding a hammer and showing no sign of calming down. The old man continued talking, his words coming faster now, tumbling over each other. "I've been here 17 years, he said, his free hand gesturing vaguely at the carved stone around them. 17 years marking it, recording it, trying to finish before the convergence. Because if it's not finished, if the pattern isn't complete, then when they come through, there won't be any barrier, any boundary, any way to tell what's real and what's them. Do you understand? Do you have any comprehension of what I'm telling you?" Virgil admitted that he didn't understand, that he'd simply been doing his survey work and had heard the hammering and come to investigate, and could they perhaps discuss this more calmly, perhaps over a meal in the settlement? And did the old man have a name he could share? The question about his name seemed to break something in the old man's agitation, and he stopped his circling, his shoulders slumping slightly as if some great tension had suddenly released. "My name was Josiah Craven," the old man said quietly, was being the operative word, "because I'm not certain that what I am now bears enough resemblance to what I was to claim the same designation. I was a professor once, mathematics and natural philosophy at the Virginia Military Institute. I came to these mountains in 1880 to study certain geological formations that had been reported by hunters and trappers, formations that seemed to defy conventional understanding of how rock stratifies and weathers. What I found was so far beyond geological anomaly that I couldn't leave, couldn't return to my former life knowing what I knew, couldn't pretend that reality was as simple and ordered as we teach our students it is." Virgil listened, his surveyor's training giving him patience with long explanations and detailed observations, though he was already mentally noting that this Josiah Craven was clearly suffering from some form of mental deterioration, probably brought on by isolation and whatever obsession had driven him to spend 17 years alone on this ridge. The old man seemed to read something in Virgil's expression because his own face hardened again, the wild intensity returning to his eyes. "You think I'm mad," he said flatly. "That's what everyone thinks when they encounter someone who's seen past the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the nature of existence. You think these marks are meaningless, the product of a damaged mind seeking pattern where none exists. But you're wrong. Would you like me to prove you're wrong? Would you like to see what I've spent 17 years trying to contain?" Virgil absolutely did not want to see anything of the sort. Wanted nothing more than to extract himself from this situation and return to his survey work. But something in the old man's voice, a quality that sat uneasily between threat and genuine question, made him hesitate, made him uncertain whether refusing would be safer than agreeing. Before Virgil could formulate a response that might allow him to gracefully exit the situation, Josiah had turned and was moving along the ridge with that same unsettling speed that seemed at odds with his apparent age and physical condition, and Virgil found himself following, partly from curiosity and partly from a sense that leaving the old man alone in this state might somehow be more dangerous than staying close enough to monitor the situation. They walked north along the ridge for perhaps 20 minutes, Josiah moving with the confidence of someone who'd traveled this path thousands of times, Virgil struggling to keep up while also watching his footing on the increasingly rough terrain. The ridge was narrowing as Hosea back at the boarding house had warned, in places only 6 or 7 feet wide with steep drop-offs on both sides, and the trees that had covered the lower slopes were thinning out up here, replaced by stunted pines and exposed rock. They rounded a promontory and Virgil saw that ahead the ridge opened into a broader area perhaps 30 yards across where the rock formed a natural platform or shelf, and as they got closer he could see that this entire area was covered with the same kind of carved symbols he'd seen Josiah working on earlier. But here they were more extensive, more complex, covering every available surface in an intricate web of intersecting lines and geometric shapes. Josiah stopped at the edge of this carved area and turned to face Virgil, and the expression on his face was difficult to read, containing elements of pride and fear and something else that might have been regret. "What you're looking at," Josiah said, his voice steadier now, more like what Virgil imagined a professor's voice might sound like, "is 17 years of calculation and inscription. A mathematical representation of a boundary condition that exists at this location in a form that most human minds cannot perceive without assistance. The symbols you see are not arbitrary. They correspond to a geometric structure that extends in dimensions beyond the 3 we commonly experience. And their purpose is to reinforce the barrier between our reality and another that intersects with ours at this precise location during certain astronomical alignments that occur on a cycle of approximately 24 years. Virgil's patience with what was clearly delusional ranting was wearing thin, and he was about to make his excuses and leave when Josiah did something that changed everything. The old man raised his hand and placed it flat against one of the carved symbols, a complex interlocking pattern near the center of the platform, and as Virgil watched, the symbol began to glow with a faint luminescence, pale blue, like foxfire. And that glow began to spread outward from Josiah's hand, following the carved lines across the rock surface, illuminating the pattern in a way that made its underlying structure suddenly visible. It wasn't random at all. The symbols formed a coherent whole, a geometric construction that seemed to fold in on itself in ways that hurt to look at directly, that created an optical illusion of depth where there should be only flat stone. And as the glow spread further, Virgil could see that the entire platform was covered with one continuous design, intricate beyond anything he could have imagined, beautiful and terrible and completely impossible. The air above the platform began to shimmer, a heat haze effect except that the temperature hadn't changed, and through that shimmer, Virgil could see something that made his surveyor's mind, trained to observe and record reality with precision, stumble and falter. The sky was wrong. Not the sky he could see when he looked away from the platform, which was normal autumn overcast, but the sky visible through the shimmer was a different color entirely, a shade that he had no name for because it wasn't in the spectrum of colors that human eyes are supposed to perceive. And in that wrongly colored sky, there were shapes moving, things that were too far away to see clearly, but whose very existence violated every principle of natural philosophy that Virgil had ever learned. Josiah's voice came from beside him, quiet now, almost gentle. "Do you see now? Do you understand why I can't leave? Why I have to finish the pattern before the next convergence, which my calculations indicate will occur in April of 1904. If the barrier isn't complete when they attempt to cross over, when the dimensional intersection reaches its maximum point, there won't be anything to stop them from manifesting fully in our reality. And what that would mean for not just this valley, but potentially for a much wider area, is something I've spent 17 years trying not to think about too directly because the implications are paralyzing." The glow was fading now, the shimmer in the air diminishing, and within moments the platform looked like nothing more than carved rock again, though Virgil knew with absolute certainty that what he'd just witnessed wasn't hallucination or a trick of light, but something genuinely anomalous, genuinely impossible according to every framework of understanding he possessed. He found himself sitting down quite suddenly, his legs apparently having decided that they'd had enough of supporting his weight, while his mind tried to process what he'd just seen. And Josiah sat down beside him, setting his hammer and chisel carefully on the stone between them. "I'm sorry," the old man said after a moment of silence. "I shouldn't have shown you. It's not fair to do that to someone, to shatter their comfortable understanding of how the world works without their consent. But you seemed like someone who might be able to handle it, who might be able to help. And I'm getting old, getting tired, and the work is extensive, and I'm no longer certain I can finish it in time." Virgil asked the obvious question, the one his surveyor's training insisted he ask, even though part of him desperately didn't want to hear the answer, about what exactly those shapes in the wrong-colored sky were. And Josiah took a long time before responding, his gnarled hands absently tracing one of the carved patterns on the rock beside him. "I don't know," he finally said. "I have theories, mathematical models that suggest there are entities that exist primarily in dimensional spaces we don't normally have access to, and that our reality and theirs intersect at certain points, this ridge being one of them, during certain temporal cycles determined by astronomical alignments that I've spent years calculating. But theories are just frameworks we construct to make sense of observations. And my observations of them have been limited to brief glimpses during minor convergences, nothing like what will happen in 1904 if my projections are correct. What I do know is that they're aware of us, aware of our reality, and they want in, though whether that desire is predatory or simply exploratory I cannot determine. What I also know is that the indigenous peoples who lived in these mountains before European settlement knew about the convergences and had their own methods of reinforcing the barrier, methods that were apparently effective for centuries until those people were displaced and their knowledge lost." Virgil spent the next several hours on that platform with Josiah, listening to explanations that mixed advanced mathematics with observations that sounded like they came from some fever dream, watching as the old man demonstrated how certain symbols in the carved pattern resonated with each other when traced in specific sequences, creating harmonic frequencies that Virgil could feel more than hear, vibrations that seemed to come from the stone itself, or perhaps from somewhere deeper, from the fabric of space that Josiah insisted was thinner here than in most places. As the afternoon progressed toward evening and the light began to fail, Virgil found himself faced with a decision that would shape everything that came after. He could dismiss what he'd seen as elaborate trickery or the product of his own overtired mind, return to his survey work as if this encounter had never happened, complete his assessment for the railway company, and move on to his next assignment. Or he could accept that what Josiah had shown him was genuine, that there were indeed holes in reality on this ridge, and that an elderly man working alone might not be able to complete the protective pattern in time to prevent something catastrophic from occurring. The choice should have been easy. Virgil was a practical man, a man of measurements and calculations, someone who dealt in concrete reality and had no patience for metaphysics or mysticism. But he'd seen what he'd seen, felt what he'd felt, and his surveyor's instinct for accurate observation wouldn't let him pretend otherwise. When Josiah asked if Virgil would consider staying at least for a few days to help with the work, to use his surveying skills to verify the geometric precision of the pattern and perhaps assist with the remaining sections that needed to be carved, Virgil heard himself agreeing before he'd consciously made the decision, and he saw something like relief wash across the old man's weathered face. That night, back at Hosea's boarding house, Virgil tried to record the day's events in his field book, the same book where he'd been meticulously documenting his survey measurements. But he found that the right words wouldn't come, that what he'd experienced resisted being translated into the precise technical language he normally used. He finally settled for a brief entry, noting that he'd encountered an elderly hermit on the ridge and had been delayed in his survey work. Nothing about glowing symbols or dimensional intersections or impossible skies, and he closed the book with a feeling that he was already crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. Over the following days, Virgil fell into a routine that split his time between his official survey work, which he completed in the mornings, and assisting Josiah on the ridge platform, which occupied his afternoons and often extended into the early evening hours when the light allowed. The work with Josiah was unlike anything Virgil had done before, requiring him to use his surveying tools not to measure the physical landscape, but to verify the geometric relationships within the carved pattern, ensuring that angles were precise to fractions of a degree and that the spacing between symbols maintained exact mathematical ratios that Josiah claimed were critical to the pattern's function. The old man had notebooks full of calculations, pages and pages of equations that Virgil could only partially follow despite his own mathematical training, and he claimed that any deviation from these precise specifications would create weak points in the barrier that could be exploited during a convergence. As they worked together, Josiah shared more of his story, how he'd come to the ridge originally as a skeptical scientist investigating reports of strange phenomena, how his first glimpse of what lay beyond the barrier had both terrified and fascinated him in equal measure, How he'd gradually realized that the indigenous protective symbols he'd found were degrading over time and needed to be reinforced or replaced entirely if they were to remain effective. I tried to return to civilization multiple times in the early years, Josiah explained. Tried to warn authorities or academic institutions about what I'd discovered. But I quickly learned that describing impossible things to people who hadn't seen them was worse than useless. It marked you as mad and ensured that no one would take anything you said seriously. Have you ever tried to explain something you knew was true, but sounded absolutely insane when you said it out loud? Drop in the comments if you've ever had that experience of knowing something that you couldn't convince anyone else to believe. It's a special kind of isolation, that knowledge without validation. Virgil was experiencing his own version of that isolation because when he went back to the boarding house each evening and sat across the dinner table from Hosea, he couldn't bring himself to mention what he was really doing on the ridge. Couldn't explain why his survey work was progressing so slowly. Hosea would ask about his progress in that careful way that suggested he already knew something was unusual, and Virgil would give vague answers about difficult terrain and the need for extra measurements, and Hosea would nod with an expression that might have been knowing or might have been simple acceptance. The other residents of Ravenmoor Crossing, the few that Virgil encountered during his time in the settlement, seemed to exist in their own separate worlds, going about their business with a kind of methodical determination that suggested they were maintaining routines more from habit than purpose. There was a woman named Parthenia who ran the general store, perhaps 40 years old with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful and eyes that never quite met Virgil's when they spoke. There was the blacksmith, a man called Jubal, who stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed almost too broad for his body and hands that could bend iron horseshoes like they were wire. There was a preacher who wasn't really a preacher anymore, a hollow-eyed man named Morvith, who would stand sometimes at the door of the abandoned church and watch people pass without speaking, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curses, impossible to tell which. Virgil tried once to ask Hosea about Josiah Craven, whether anyone in the settlement knew about the old man living on the ridge. And Hosea's face had gone carefully blank in a way that was more telling than any expression. "We don't talk about those who've gone to the high places," he'd said quietly. "It's better that way, better to let them do what they feel they must, and not ask questions that might have answers we'd rather not know." The weeks passed, and Virgil found himself settling into this strange dual existence, railway surveyor by morning, assistant to a possibly mad mathematics professor by afternoon. And with each passing day, the distinction between his two roles became less clear because his surveying work was increasingly influenced by what he was learning from Josiah about the geometry of space and how it could fold and intersect in ways that conventional mapping didn't account for. He began to notice things in the landscape that he'd never paid attention to before, places where the terrain seemed to create natural geometric patterns, where rock formations aligned in ways that seemed too precise to be coincidental, where certain valleys or ridge lines formed angles that matched the symbols Josiah had carved into the platform. It was as if the landscape itself was part of some larger pattern, some structure that extended beyond the visible into dimensions that Virgil's instruments couldn't measure, but that he was learning to perceive through the education Josiah was providing. The old man had given him one of the notebooks, the one containing what Josiah called the fundamental equations, the mathematical framework that described how the dimensional intersection worked and how the protective symbols derived their efficacy from geometric principles that existed independent of human understanding. Virgil would spend his evenings studying these equations, cross-referencing them with his own survey data, and slowly a picture was emerging of the mountains as not just physical landscape, but as a kind of mathematical structure, a terrain where topology mattered more than topography. It was transformative and terrifying in equal measure, this new way of seeing the world, and Virgil began to understand why Josiah had chosen isolation over trying to communicate these insights to people who lacked the framework to comprehend them. One afternoon in mid-October, as they were working on a particularly complex section of the pattern that required precise alignment with astronomical markers that wouldn't be visible for another week, Josiah suddenly stopped his carving and turned to Virgil with an expression that was troubled and urgent. "I need to show you something," the old man said, his voice carrying the quality of barely controlled anxiety that Virgil had learned to recognize as indicating something significant. "I've been avoiding it because I didn't want to burden you further, but I think you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here." They followed a narrow path that led off the main platform, descending slightly along the northern face of the ridge, and after perhaps 10 minutes of careful navigation over increasingly treacherous terrain, they reached a section of rock face that had been carved even more extensively than the platform, the symbols here smaller and more densely packed, covering every available surface in layers that suggested years of intensive work. But it wasn't the symbols that Josiah wanted to show him. The old man approached a particular section of the rock and began tracing a sequence of symbols in a specific order, his fingers moving with practiced precision, and as Virgil watched, that same pale blue glow began to emanate from the carved lines. But this time, instead of spreading outward, it seemed to concentrate, to gather at a central point, and where it gathered, the rock itself began to change, becoming translucent, then transparent, then simply not there, until there was an opening in the rock face perhaps 3 feet in diameter, and through that opening Virgil could see into darkness that was absolute, that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lacking it. "Look," Josiah said quietly, and handed Virgil a lantern that he'd brought from somewhere. And Virgil held the lantern up to the opening and looked inside. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The space beyond the opening was larger than should have been possible given the dimensions of the rock face, much larger, extending away into distances that the lantern light couldn't reach. And the surfaces visible within that space were carved with symbols identical to those on the platform, thousands upon thousands of them covering walls that curved away into the darkness, following geometry that made Virgil's eyes water when he tried to follow the lines. "This is what lies beneath the barrier," Josiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the space where our reality and theirs intersect most closely. The carvings you see extending into the darkness are the original indigenous protective symbols, created over centuries by people who understood the danger far better than I do. I've been maintaining them, reinforcing them where they've degraded. But there are sections that extend so far into the intersection that I can't reach them anymore, areas where the boundary between realities becomes so thin that spending time there affects your perception in ways that don't always reverse when you return." Virgil asked the question that seemed most pressing, about whether Josiah had explored the full extent of this space, and the old man's face took on an expression that was haunted and distant. "I've gone as far as I dared," he said slowly. "Perhaps a quarter-mile into the intersection, following the carved passages that spiral downward and inward. And what I saw there, what I heard, convinced me that I'd reached my limit, that going further would mean